The lavish golden chandeliers of the Hudson, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, shimmered overhead as guests dined on exorbitantly priced delicacies. The place reeked of old money and new egos, a playground for the elite, where power was a currency and reputation was everything. Among the VIPs that evening sat Eric Trump, Sun President, dressed in a tailored navy suit. He leaned back in his chair, spinning a glass of expensive bourbon between his fingers. A few of his friends, heirs to fortunes of their own, sat around the table, laughing at crude jokes only they found amusing. The restaurant buzzed with the whispers of celebrities, socialites, and power brokers. At that moment, a young waitress, Olivia Carter, approached the table. She had been working double shift for months to pay off her student loans. Tonight, exhaustion tugged at her, but she kept her smile in place as she set down a plate of filet mignon in front of Eric. He barely glanced at her before snorting. "What took you so long? You stopped to fix your makeup in the back?" A few of his friends chuckled, but Olivia stiffened. She wasn't expecting courtesy, but blatant disrespect hit differently. "I apologize, sir," she said evenly. "The kitchen was a bit backed up." Eric scoffed, swirling his drink. "Right, but you just don't know how to do your damn job. This is why people like you will never make it anywhere." A hush fell over the nearby tables. Olivia's heart pounded. A part of her wanted to let it slide, just another rich man flinging his weight around. But something inside her refused to bow. "I may be serving your dinner tonight," she said calmly, "but at least I know how to respect people." Gasps echoed around the room. Eric's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as his friends muttered in disbelief. One of them chuckled. "Wow, this one's got a mouth on her," said a blonde-haired man at the table. Eric's face twisted into a smirk. "You think that attitude's going to get you anywhere, sweetheart?" Olivia straightened her shoulders. "Respect takes you farther than money ever will." Eric slammed his glass down, standing up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor. "You think you're better than me," he growled. Security was already moving, sensing the tension. But before they could intervene, a new voice cut through the air. "That's enough, Eric." The restaurant fell into a stunned silence. Olivia turned to see a familiar face, one she never expected to step in. Donald Trump Jr. stood at the bar, arms crossed, eyes locked on his younger brother. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a ripple through the crowd. Olivia exhaled. The air in the Hudson was thick with tension. Olivia could feel every pair of eyes on her, their gazes a mixture of shock, amusement, and curiosity. Eric Trump's face was a shade of red that bordered on dangerous. But it was Donald Trump Jr.'s intervention that had truly shifted the atmosphere. "Eric," Don Jr. repeated, his voice lower but firm. "Sit down." Eric hesitated, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. But something in his brother's tone made him obey. With a huff, he dropped back into his chair, grabbing his drink and downing the rest in one gulp. The tension should have dissipated, but instead, it only thickened. Olivia could feel it coiling around her like a snake ready to strike. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, but before she could, Don Jr. turned his gaze to her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice devoid of the usual smug arrogance she associated with his family. "I'm fine," she replied, though her hands trembled slightly. A slow smirk curled on Don Jr.'s lips. "Brave girl," he murmured before turning to Eric's group. "You all should be ashamed. She's working her ass off, and you act like you own the world." Eric scoffed. "Spare me the moral lecture, Don. Since when did you become the patron saint of waitresses?" Don Jr. laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You'd be surprised how quickly life humbles you, little brother." A flicker of something, maybe confusion, maybe resentment, flashed in Eric's eyes. But Olivia had no time to analyze it, because just then, the restaurant doors swung open, and in walked someone who made the entire place go silent. A woman, dressed in an elegant midnight blue gown, with piercing green eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much. Melania Trump. She didn't need to say a word. Just her presence alone was enough to make Eric pale and Don Jr. stiffen. But her gaze wasn't on them. It was on Olivia. And then, with a slow, deliberate step, she started walking toward her. Olivia felt her pulse quicken as Melania Trump approached. The former First Lady's expression was unreadable, calm, composed, but carrying a weight of something unspoken. The restaurant had fallen eerily silent, the kind of silence that only came when power entered the room. Eric shifted in his seat, his bravado fading under his stepmother's icy gaze. Even Don Jr., usually unfazed, straightened his posture as if bracing himself. Olivia swallowed hard, unsure of what to expect. Melania stopped just a foot away from her, studying her carefully before speaking in a voice that was both soft and commanding. "You have courage," she said, her accent giving the words a deliberate weight. "Not many do." Olivia blinked. Was this approval? Eric scoffed. "Oh, please. Are we really doing this?" Melania turned sharply to him, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know why your father became the man he is, Eric?" She didn't wait for an answer. "Because he never learned when to stop. And you? You are making the same mistakes." Eric's face twitched, caught between defiance and something dangerously close to doubt. But Melania wasn't done. She turned back to Olivia, her expression softening slightly. "Do not let men like this intimidate you," she said. "They act powerful, but real strength is knowing when to rise above." Olivia barely had time to process before Melania turned on her heel and left as swiftly as she had arrived. The entire restaurant remained frozen for a few moments longer. Then, almost as if on cue, quiet murmurs rippled through the air. The moment had passed, but its impact lingered. Don Jr. let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn," he muttered. "She still got it." Eric glared at him before pushing his chair back abruptly. "This is ridiculous." He stormed out, his entourage scrambling after him. Olivia exhaled, feeling a rush of relief, but also an unsettling sense that this was far from over. Then Don Jr. leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You just made an enemy, you know." Olivia met his gaze. "So what?" He smirked. "I like you." And with that, he tossed the bill on the table, far more than necessary, before following his brother out the door. Olivia stood there, realizing that she had just stepped into a world she never wanted to be part of. The echoes of Eric's stomping footsteps still lingered in the air, but Olivia's heart was pounding for an entirely different reason. The adrenaline, the humiliation, the unexpected validation from Melania, it all twisted inside her like a storm she couldn't contain. She looked down at the absurd amount of cash Don Jr. had left on the table. It wasn't a tip, it was a statement. A warning. A game piece played strategically. She wasn't a pawn. She clenched her fists, exhaling slowly, forcing herself to focus on the fact that she still had a job to finish. But as she turned, a hand brushed against her arm. "You handled that well," a deep voice murmured. She spun around to find Don Jr. still standing there, his smirk replaced with something else, something unreadable. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He studied her for a moment, his blue eyes sharper than she expected. "I want to know why you're not scared." Olivia scoffed. "You think I should be?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't understand. Eric doesn't forget things like this." The weight of his words pressed down on her chest. She did understand. She had stepped into their world, a world where power wasn't just something you had. It was something you wielded, and she had just embarrassed someone who was used to being untouchable. "I can handle myself," she said, lifting her chin. Don Jr.'s smirk returned, but this time it wasn't cocky. It was almost impressed. "You're interesting," he murmured, stepping closer. "Too close. People like you either rise or get crushed." His words sent a chill down her spine. Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "Is there a problem here?" A man in a dark suit, one of the restaurant security staff, had stepped forward. He wasn't looking at Olivia. He was looking at Don Jr. For the first time that night, she saw it, the shift. Don Jr., the confident, untouchable heir, hesitated. And in that moment, she realized something. This wasn't just about her. Olivia's pulse thundered in her ears. The security guard's presence seemed to shift the air around them, pressing in on the moment like a silent witness to a crime in progress. Don Jr., didn't move right away. Instead, he studied the guard with an almost amused expression, the kind that said, "I know exactly who sent you." Olivia caught it too, the flicker of irritation. The way Don Jr. smirk tightened just slightly before he finally stepped back. "No problem at all," he said smoothly, flashing the guard an easy grin. "Just giving the lady some advice." The security guard didn't so much as blink. "Enjoy your evening, sir." It wasn't suggestion. Don Jr. gave Olivia one last lingering look before turning on his heel and strolling toward the exit, his hands casually tucked into his pockets as if he hadn't just hinted at something dangerous. Olivia exhaled, only now realizing how tense her body had been. "You okay?" the security guard asked. She nodded, but deep down, she wasn't sure. The rest of the night was a blur. Orders, dishes, murmurs of scandal. People looked at her differently now. Some with sympathy, others with barely concealed intrigue. She was no longer just another waitress. She was the girl who stood up to Eric Trump, and that kind of attention came with consequences. By the time Olivia stepped out of the restaurant, the city was humming with its usual symphony. Honking cabs, distant laughter, the buzz of neon signs reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. She pulled her coat tighter around herself, exhaustion clinging to her bones. Then she saw him, a figure leaning against a sleek black car across the street. Don Jr. Her stomach clenched. Of course he wasn't done. With a sigh, she walked straight toward him. "You waiting for someone?" His smirk was already in place. "You. Why?" "Because I know how this story plays out." His tone was softer than before, but no less unsettling. "You think Eric's going to let this slide?" Olivia crossed her arms. "I think he's a spoiled brat who got embarrassed. He'll find another way to stroke his ego." Don Jr. let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You don't get it. You humiliated him. In front of his friends. His ego isn't just bruised, it's shattered." She swallowed but kept her face neutral. "And what? He's going to come after me? Because I didn't kiss his boots." Don Jr. tilted his head, considering her. Not him. A chill ran down her spine. "Then who?" she asked carefully. He hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. "My father likes control," he finally said. "He doesn't like weak links." And Eric just became one. Olivia's breath hitched. "You're saying—" "I'm saying," Don Jr. interrupted, his voice dropping lower. For the first time, Olivia saw it, the tension in his shoulders, the flicker of something behind his eyes. Morning light filtered through Olivia's tiny apartment window, painting streaks of gold across the peeling wallpaper. She hadn't slept. Her mind had replayed the events of the previous night in an endless, looping reel. The smirk on Eric's face, the way Don Jr. had stepped in, the icy weight of Melania's gaze, and that final, chilling warning. You might not be the only one in trouble. She told herself that it didn't matter, that she wasn't afraid, that all she had done was stand up for herself. But as she buttoned her uniform and laced up her worn sneakers, a tiny, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered, "You just made enemies you can't afford to have." She shoved the thought away and grabbed her keys. The Hudson was waiting. By the time Olivia arrived at the restaurant, something felt off. She noticed it immediately. The way her coworkers whispered when she walked past, the way the manager, Frank Russo, avoided eye contact. Frank was normally a hard ass, but he was fair. He'd hired her even when she had no prior experience, had given her extra shifts when she needed the money, and had even let her crash in the staff break room once when her apartment's heating had gone out. But now, he wouldn't even look at her. She barely had time to put down her bag before he cleared his throat and motioned toward his office. "Olivia, a word." She followed him in, dread pooling in her gut. The moment the door shut, she knew, her hands clenched at her sides. "You're firing me." Frank sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not my call, kid." A bitter laugh escaped her. Of course it isn't. She had seen this coming. Of course she had. What did she think? That she could humiliate Eric Trump in a room full of Manhattan's elite and walk away unscathed? "How much did they pay you?" she asked, voice tight. Frank's jaw tensed. "It wasn't like that." She scoffed. "It's exactly like that." Olivia? He exhaled slowly, looking more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. The owners got a call this morning. They didn't say from who, but he trailed off. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Eric, she muttered. Maybe, maybe not. Frank gave her a look. You think those people handle things directly? No, they make a few calls, pull a few strings. Suddenly, you're a problem. Olivia swallowed hard. I need this job, Frank. He flinched. I know, he admitted. But if I have to fight this, I'm out too. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. But it was reality. For all her talk about respect and dignity, in the end, it hadn't mattered. Power always won. She straightened her shoulders, refusing to let the sting of betrayal show. Fine. When do I get my last paycheck? Frank hesitated. Her stomach dropped. You're kidding. They're claiming you broke professional conduct policy. They're withholding it. A sharp, burning anger shot through her veins. That's illegal. Frank looked away. Good luck fighting it. That was it. Then she had nothing. No job. No paycheck. No way to pay rent. And the worst part? She hadn't just lost her income. She had lost her reputation. Word would spread. No one in Manhattan would touch her now. The Trumps had made sure of it. The breaking point. She left the Hudson without looking back. The cold air hit her like a slap. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She had one missed call from her landlord. Of course, they'd been lenient the past 2 months. But now, with rent due and no paycheck coming, she was screwed. For a split second, she let herself feel the weight of it all. The anger, the fear, the helplessness. Then her phone buzzed again. A text, unknown number, need to talk. Meet me at Bryant Park. Now, her pulse skipped. It had to be Don Jr. For a moment, she debated ignoring it. But then she thought about last night, the way he had hesitated, the way he had looked at the security guard like he was the one being watched. You might not be the only one in trouble. Something was happening. Something bigger than her, bigger than Eric's bruised ego. She had no job, no options. So what the hell did she have to lose? The meeting. Bryant Park was nearly empty when she arrived. The sky was a dull gray, the air thick with the scent of oncoming rain. She spotted Don Jr. instantly. He was leaning against a lamppost, dressed in another perfectly tailored suit, but he looked different than he had last night. Tense, alert, like a man walking a tightrope over a fire. When he saw her, he didn't smirk, didn't throw out one of his usual cocky remarks. He just nodded. You came. She crossed her arms. I'm unemployed. Figured I had time. A flicker of guilt passed through his eyes. So quick she almost missed it. I heard, he admitted. I told you they wouldn't let this slide. She exhaled sharply. Is that why you called me here? To say I told you so? No. He glanced around before lowering his voice. I called you because we're both in deep shit. Something in his tone made her shiver. What do you mean? He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. I mean, he said, voice barely above a whisper, I think my father knows what happened last night, and I think he's pissed. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, Olivia let out a dry, humorless laugh. Oh, great, she muttered. So, billionaire president out to ruin my life. Fantastic. Don Jr. didn't laugh. Instead, he took a step closer, his voice urgent. This isn't a joke, Olivia. She swallowed. For the first time since this whole mess started, real fear crept in. What do we do? She asked quietly. Don Jr. exhaled. We figure out what he's planning. She blinked. We. He smirked then, just slightly. You think I'm going to let you have all the fun? Despite everything, despite the storm raging around her, Olivia almost smiled. The air in Bryant Park felt heavier than before, charged with something unseen. Olivia stood in front of Don Jr., her arms crossed, trying to read between the lines of his warning. Donald Trump was involved now. She wasn't sure if that was better or worse. Before she could ask another question, the low rumble of an approaching car drew both of their gazes toward the street. A black SUV polished to perfection, pulled up to the curb. The back door swung open, and there he was, Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, the man who had built an empire, led a nation, and cultivated an image of invincibility. Olivia's breath hitched. He stepped out of the car with the same confidence that had made him a global figure, chin lifted, tailored overcoat draped over his suit, and an expression that gave nothing away. People on the sidewalk slowed their pace, whispering to one another, pulling out their phones to snap pictures. He didn't acknowledge them. His focus was locked on his son. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and commanding. Don Jr. stiffened. "Dad." "I said get in the car." Olivia felt the shift in power. The way Don Jr.'s usual cockiness faltered. With a tight jaw, he obeyed, slipping into the back seat. Trump's gaze finally moved to Olivia. For a second, she expected him to ignore her completely. Instead, he gestured toward the car. "You too." Her pulse raced. Every logical part of her brain screamed no, told her to turn around and walk away. But curiosity, dangerous, stupid curiosity, kept her rooted to the spot. Before she could talk herself out of it, she climbed inside. The inside of the SUV was as sleek and intimidating as its exterior. Dark leather, tinted windows, and an air control that was impossible to ignore. Donald Trump sat across from her, expression unreadable. For a long, tense moment, he simply studied her. Then, "I don't like messes," he said. Olivia swallowed. Don Jr. shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I heard what happened," Trump continued. "Eric was out of line." She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that wasn't on the list. "You're not mad?" she asked carefully. A ghost of a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't say that." Don Jr. exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "Dad!" She got fired because of Eric's tantrum. They blacklisted her. Trump's expression darkened. "I know." Something in the way he said it sent a chill down Olivia's spine. "I built my name on loyalty," he said, "on knowing when to cut people loose and when to bring them back in." He paused, tilting his head slightly. Eric forgot that last night. Olivia held his gaze, refusing to shrink under the weight of his presence. "So what happens now?" Trump leaned back, fingers tapping against the leather armrest. "You're going back to work." Her breath hitched. "Just like that?" Don Jr. blinked, caught off guard. "Wait, you're serious?" Trump's eyes didn't leave Olivia's. "Frank will reinstate you by the end of the day." It should have felt like a victory. But Olivia knew better. Nothing came without a price. She clenched her fists. "And what do you want in return?" Trump's smirk deepened, but his voice remained measured. "I want you to remember who helped you. Not a threat. A reminder. A favor she hadn't agreed to yet." She exhaled slowly. "I didn't ask for your help." Trump chuckled. "No, but you needed it." The SUV slowed to a stop outside the Hudson. Her heart pounded as she glanced at Don Jr. He looked just as unsettled as she felt. "Go on," Trump said. "You've got a shift to start." She hesitated for only a second before opening the door and stepping out. As she walked toward the restaurant, she could still feel his presence behind her. The Hudson felt different when Olivia stepped back inside. The same golden chandeliers hung overhead. The same murmur of privileged conversations filled the air. But something had shifted. People noticed her, not just her coworkers, who had assumed she was gone for good, but the guests, the high society crowd, the regulars who thrived on power and whispered secrets between sips of expensive wine. They had all heard the rumors, and they all knew who had brought her back. Frank Russo stood behind the bar, his hands pressed against the counter. The moment he saw her, his jaw clenched. "Back already?" he muttered. Olivia held her head high. "Looks like it." Frank exhaled through his nose. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. Donald Trump's influence had spoken for itself. "Your uniform's still in the back," he said gruffly. She nodded. Just like that, she was back. A week passed. Then, too, things settled. Eric never returned to the restaurant. Maybe he had been told to stay away, or maybe his ego simply couldn't handle the humiliation. Don Jr. texted her once. "Don't waste a second chance." Not everyone gets one. She never responded. Because the truth was, she wasn't staying. She had fought to get her job back, but not because she wanted it. She had fought because she refused to let them take it from her. But this world, the power games, the unspoken debts, it wasn't hers. So, on a quiet afternoon, Olivia turned in her resignation. Frank didn't say much when she handed him the letter. Maybe he knew she wasn't meant to stay. She walked out of the Hudson with her head held high, knowing she had won. Not because she had been reinstated, but because she had left on her own terms. She had beaten them, and she would never let them pull her into their world again. As she stepped out onto the bustling streets of Manhattan, the sun breaking through the gray clouds above, Olivia smiled. No more debts, no more strings, just freedom. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.